Thank you so much, Sal, and thank you for coming tonight. I couldn't be more delighted to be back here. I have really fond memories of when I was here 4 years ago, when I was hawking my book on Franklin Roosevelt and his first 100 days. And that's connected, really, to what I'm here to talk about tonight. Because when I was doing that book, I got kind of interested in presidential debuts, especially at a time of crisis. And as it happened, as you know, in 2009, we were in the greatest economic crisis since 1933. So it made some sense for me to return to the topic. My book on FDR got new life when Obama said on 60 Minutes that he was reading my book and another book when he was asked about Roosevelt. So suddenly, not so shabby, you know. And by that time, I'd already decided to write this book on his first year. There've been a lot of books about Obama, about his background, his campaign, and I wanted to be the first, and was the first, about his presidency. But I thought I'd first give you just a little bit of background about my own connection to him. I was born and raised in Chicago. My mother was the first woman elected in Cook County, Illinois, which is a rough neighborhood. And I was saying at dinner, I was explaining how she faced down Old Man Daley to go on the ticket and break the gender barrier in 1972. And she met Obama when she was commissioner of the sanitary district, and Obama was working as a community organizer, and my mother liked to answer her own phone. She thought a public official shouldn't have their calls screened, that she worked for the taxpayers and she should answer her own damn phone. And Obama was having problems with a sewage treatment plant. This is in his first book, Dreams from My Father. And she was one of the only people who gave him the time of day as a community organizer. And so when she died shortly after the election, even though he had a lot of other things to do, he was in touch with the family because he remembered her fondly. It showed that he did kind of remember a little bit where he came from. I didn't meet him in the 90s and 80s. My cousin, his wife, was working in City Hall in Chicago with Michelle Obama, and he kept telling me about this guy, Barack Obama. He's this state senator. He's a really smart guy. You got to meet him and got to write a column about him. I said, Bob, I write a column for Newsweek. We circulate in Alaska and Hawaii and Georgia. I don't think they really want to know about this state senator in your neighborhood. I'm sure he's a nice guy, but I don't think so, And so then my aunt died, my mother's sister, in 2002, and we were at my cousin's house, who had been telling me about Obama, and Obama came to the funeral and came by afterward, and that was the first time I met him, and we didn't talk for too long, but I saw that my cousin was right. He was a bright guy. He just lost for the House, and he told me he might be running for the Senate. I said, wait a minute, you just lost for the House, and now you're going to run for the Senate? Okay, but it worked out for him. And then I saw him a couple other times, and then you all remember when he gave that speech at the convention in 2004, and after that, and after he was elected to the Senate, but before he was sworn into the Senate, we decided to do a cover story on him in Newsweek, and it was the first cover story, there now have been hundreds, about Barack Obama. And so I came down to Washington from where we live now in New Jersey to interview him, and I brought my then 13-year-old son with me, Tommy Alter, who really wanted to go because he's still a Chicago fan and the Washington Wizards were playing the Bulls, and it was an excuse for him to get Dad to take him to a basketball game. And what he had to do was learn a little bit about what I do for a living and sit in on this interview. So after the interview, he says, Dad, that guy Barack Obama, he's going to be president in 2008. And I said, Tommy, when you've been in journalism as long as I have, you learn a thing or two, and he hasn't even been sworn into the Senate yet, and so 2008 is just not going to happen. Maybe 2016, you know, he's got a lot of promise. He needs to have some seasoning. So fast forward 5 years, more than 5 years, to November of last year, November of 2009, and I was interviewing the president, and as we walked into the Oval Office, I made a little small talk, and with Obama you get about minute 30, 2 minutes max, and everybody says this about him, usually in a pretty complimentary way. He's not one for a lot of idle chatter. He's very charming in the small talk period, but he knows time is short and he wants to get down to business, and so he says, okay, in a way that is unmistakable. Small talk's over. So we were in the small talk phase, and walking into the Oval Office, and I said, so did you have a good Thanksgiving, Mr. President? And he said, oh yeah, you know, we had a great time. My brother-in-law, Craig Robinson, Michelle's brother, is the coach of Oregon State, and he's the basketball team. Said, you know, they were here to play GW, George Washington University. Went to the game, and you know, my mother-in-law, she kept punching me every time the game got close. I said, you know, first of all, you're hurting me, and second of all, if you don't stop punching me, the Secret Service is going to haul you out of here. Right? So that by this time we've circled the couch. We're sitting in those wing-back chairs where you see those pictures in the Oval Office, and I said, you know, my son goes to GW, and he's friends with the guys on the basketball team. And he said, your son is already in college, that one I met? You know, it was pretty good memory, even for a politician. And I said, yeah, and then I told him a quick version of the story I just told you. He said, will you tell Tommy two things? First, say hello to him, and second, tell him he should have talked me out of it. And then he said, because he knew I was a journalist, joke. Now that is actually not on the tape. The tape of that interview is bundled with the audio version of my book, which is, I guess, available on audible.com, you know, and other places now. So some of the things I'm going to tell you are not in the book, but most of them are. I got interested in doing this because I had this connection to him, and because he was the biggest political story of my lifetime, and I've been at Newsweek for 27 years. I've covered 7 presidential elections, and there was nothing quite like this. I guess before this, my favorite one to cover was Bill Clinton in 1992. I covered a lot and interviewed a lot, and in 2000, I really enjoyed covering John McCain, in part because I got so much access to him, and was able to, that year he decided to let certain reporters spend almost all day with him. We spent more time with him than his wife, and really got to know him, and that was fascinating. But there was never anything that was quite as historic as this. After, and I was thinking about doing a book, but after the election, and then my mother died just 5 days after the election, and I felt like she would want me to do this. So I started a very intense work period, the most intense that I've ever had, where from November of 2008 until March of this year, so really, I don't know, only about 16 months or so, I worked pretty much flat out and was trying to do history on the fly. a blend of journalism and history, and to try to do three things. I had three objectives. The first was just to tell what happened, because 2009 was like drinking from a fire hose, or to use another water analogy. It was a Niagara of news. Every day, I don't know if you noticed this, but there was just so much going on, you could barely keep up with it. Hey, General Motors owns the government owns 60% of General Motors? How did that happen? You know, we're maybe going to go into another Great Depression if the banks aren't bailed out. How did they straighten that out and suddenly the banks are paying it all back? How did that happen? Suddenly we've got 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. What's the deal with that? And so I decided that I was going to try to explain what happened behind the scenes when the cameras are off, when the door of the Oval Office closes and the door of the Situation Room closes, the cabinet room. What's going on the other side? It's a pretty high bar that I set for myself. And most of it is unobtainable in the same news cycle. You just can't find out what happens very easily until you circle back a few weeks later, which very few reporters have time to do. They're so busy blogging and going on TV, and demands of the business are changing very rapidly. So that was the first thing, to just figure out what actually happened. The second objective that I had was to explain what this guy is like at work and at play. How does his mind work? How does he make decisions? What is his Zen temperament, as I call it, about? And only in a tertiary way, the third objective was, how did he do? Now, that's something that all of you can make your own assessments of. How did he do? And I do, from time to time, render some judgments. But mostly I take off my pundit hat and put on my reporter hat, my historian hat, and try to add it up and give you more information to make your own decisions about how you think he did. Because this is the most observed and least understood person on the planet. And there's so much written about him and so little understood about him. So just to give you a few examples on the what happened department, the big story of the year domestically was healthcare, obviously, and I devote a couple big chapters in the book to it. One's called Tyrannosaurus RX, and the other is called The Perfect and the Good. And the title of the second chapter on healthcare comes from something that Obama liked to say a lot, which was that, while he personally might have favored a more progressive healthcare plan ideally, that perfect objective shouldn't be the enemy of something good happening. In other words, take what you can get. Take a half loaf. Politics is the art of the possible. This partly comes out of his Chicago background, that he was going to start somewhere. But interesting, and that's what Franklin Roosevelt did in 1935 when he introduced Social Security. At the time, it was considered a very inadequate piece of legislation. It insured fewer than 40% of seniors, and it was written in a racist way so that all the occupations that blacks were in, mostly because the Southern senators insisted on this, were excluded from Social Security. And so a lot of New Dealers didn't think it was good enough. And the way you heard liberals last year saying, kill the bill, some liberals, wasn't good enough for them. And Roosevelt understood that you have to start somewhere. But Roosevelt waited for 2 years after he came in before he introduced Social Security. And Obama had only promised to do health care by the end of his first 4 years. He never promised that he was going to do it in year one. And by the way, he never promised there was going to be a public option. He never even used the phrase public option during the campaign. So what ended up happening is he did this and moved forward over the objections of everybody around him. When I learned this, I was kind of stunned. Joe Biden told him, look, the public will give you a pass on this, given the economic crisis. They'll understand that you don't have to do this now. Rahm Emanuel told me, quote, I begged the president not to do this year. David Axelrod said, let's do energy first. It's more politically sensible to lead with energy. Christina Romer, the chairwoman of the Council of Economic Advisors, made the point about how she had studied Roosevelt. Roosevelt waited 2 years. Don't do this. We're trying to prevent a depression. And he decided to move ahead anyway, virtually alone in terms of his senior advisors. This was entirely hidden for all of last year. Nobody knew this. And so at the end of the year, when I was in talking to him, I asked him, so why'd you do it? And he said, well, I told Nancy Pelosi I was going to go down 10 to 15 points in the polls, as indeed he did, and he might jeopardize his reelection. So I rephrased the question, so why'd you do it, Mr. President? And he said, well, if we didn't do it now, it wouldn't happen. And his basic view was now or never, and that there was not going to be a point where he would have more political capital than he had at the beginning when he had that momentum coming in. But I got interested in, because he hadn't talked about it that much in the campaign, and I found a document from his Senate years where it wasn't even mentioned as a priority. I got interested in why he had become so committed to it, and I heard a story from one of his aides that on election night, in a quiet moment, First what happened on election night in Chicago was that Malia asked him, Dad, what are you going to do? What's the first thing you're going to do when you're president? And he said, I told you, I'm getting you and Sasha a dog. And she said, no, the first real thing. And he kind of rolls his eyes and says to David Axelrod, she's working for her school paper now. And he wasn't really concerned about the very first things he was going to do. As it happened, he signed some important executive orders on his first day, and those were really his first acts. But he was thinking in a quiet moment that night, I heard later, about what's the big thing I'm going to do. And he decided that it would be health care for two reasons. One is that he just wanted to do something. He thought, what's the one thing I can really do for the average American to protect them to give them a greater sense of security. And when you think about healthcare, you realize that in a few years we're going to look back and say, can you believe that we lived in a country where if your kid gets cancer, you have to sell your house to pay for the what kind of world were we living in? It's sort of the way like we now look back at the segregation era or something. I think people will be kind of amazed that we lived in a country where people were kicked when they were down, where they had a pre-existing condition, they lose their job, that's bad enough, and then suddenly how are you going to pay for the treatment? And he'd heard so many stories like that when he was on the campaign. So some of it was that, and a lot of it was just that he thought that the fiscal future of the country was in peril if we didn't change the status quo, that the status quo was unsustainable. And his budget director, Peter Orszag, told him that if we stayed on the path we were on and didn't bend the cost curve, is the kind of fancy way they describe it, if we didn't do that, eventually 70% of all non-Pentagon spending would be for entitlements, health care of one kind or another, 70%. And then he actually said in the interview, it was 7-0, and that number really stuck in his mind. So something had to be done to break the status quo, and even if this bill itself doesn't fix it by itself, it begins the process. If the bill had been defeated, then everybody would have just given up and done nothing for another 20 years. But this, in the same way Social Security was fixed, Civil Rights Act of 1957 was fixed in 1964-65. Major social legislation is always a process, but it has to begin somewhere. And so he understood that. Then he made a series of of tactical mistakes, and he did a poor job, I think, of framing healthcare. As Valerie Jarrett told me, we never found the right vocabulary to explain it. And so the great surprise to me of the first year was that we expected Obama to ace communications, silver-tongued orator, do well in explaining things, and struggle in executive leadership because he had no experience. And instead, he struggled in communications, and I would argue that he aced executive leadership, and many of the people I talked to found him a very impressive executive behind the scenes, and a crisp, thoughtful, and effective decision maker. But they made these errors, and they got to a point where the whole thing had been so delayed that they were blindsided by this election in Massachusetts on January 19th. And he knew about 2 weeks before he walks into David Axelrod's office, and Obama likes to wander around. Unlike most presidents who sit in the Oval Office and summon people to see them, he is up, grabs an apple, and walks. If you're in the West Wing, you can often run into him. And I was in Axelrod's office one day, actually, and suddenly there's this skinny African-American guy at the door, and it's the president. And he's walking around all the time, and he jokes with Pete Rouse, who's the least known of the big four: Valerie Jarrett, Rahm Emanuel, David Axelrod, Pete Rouse, who had been his top aide in the Senate. He jokes with Pete, who doesn't like to go on foreign trips, and actually watch the inauguration on television from home instead of sitting in the front row. And he says, Pete doesn't like to travel so much, he won't even travel down to the Oval Office to see me, so I have to walk down the hall and see him. So he walks into Axelrod's office in January of this year, and Axelrod is reading the Boston Globe online. And he says, this is from a paragraph buried in this morning's Globe. It says, when asked why she didn't want to meet more voters, Martha Coakley, who was the Democratic candidate for Ted Kennedy's seat, as you know, replied, "What do you expect me to do? Shake hands in the cold outside Fenway Park?" Like her opponent was doing, Scott Brown. And Fenway Park, as you know, is a shrine in Boston. And people go there to pray. So Obama, understands this, and he knows immediately that it's all over, that Coakley is done, and that his dreams of his first year look like they're in tatters. And he grabs Axelrod's shirt and he says, "Tell me she didn't say that. Tell me she didn't say that. That cannot be true." And then they managed to recover, and I tell the story of how they eventually got it through. But that was the product of a kind of a busted play, and they won ugly, but they won. And I think the cost, though, was very high for him, as he predicted, politically, because it seemed like they had turned so much of it over to the Congress, the sausage factory, as it's called. And you never want to see, the reason they call it the sausage factory is you never want to see sausage being made or laws being made, right? Well, the whole American public got to see the sausage being made, and it stunk so bad it spoiled everybody's appetite for the meal. And I'm not sure that he could have avoided it, because the egos in Congress wouldn't allow him to just circumvent the committee, circumvent all the sausage making, and go right to the floor. They had a secret 800-page plan that I learned about to do that if necessary, but they probably would have lost, because the Democrats who were circumvented would have felt no ownership, and they would have voted against, as they have for the last 75 years, or most of the Republicans have voted against for the last 75 years, but the Congress hasn't passed anything. And he was getting so little cooperation from the Republicans, who were pursuing a just say no politics. So they messed it up, but they did end up winning. And it's something that cannot be taken away from Obama, and he now has joined Roosevelt and Johnson as a president of very significant domestic achievement, not just because of health care, but because of more than a dozen other pieces of legislation that were passed and signed while we were all busy leading our lives in very short order at the beginning of last year. And the stimulus, which people argued about a lot, but most people didn't really know what was in that $787 billion package. It was the largest tax cut since Ronald Reagan. Some people say even bigger than Reagan for the middle class. The largest infrastructure bill since the interstate highways in the 50s, largest education bill since the 1960s, the largest aid to science and research since the 60s, and the first real alternative energy bill ever. So there was a lot in that that didn't get digested and also wasn't sold very well by the administration. So healthcare and the stimulus is kind of one narrative or two. The auto bailouts and what happened behind the scenes there is a very kind of compelling story in itself that helped to, I think they expected the reaction to be much better from the public. They understood that the public was against bank bailouts, but they thought they would be for bailouts that saved auto jobs, and it turned out the public wasn't for that either, which was a surprise. That's also worked out much better than anybody had any reason to believe, and General Motors is now reporting profit. If General Motors had gone under, we probably would have lost so many more jobs that we would have likely tipped into a depression on that basis alone. The economy was losing 740,000 jobs a month when Barack Obama took office. It's now adding 235,000 jobs a month. We still have a long way to catch up. And unemployment is still about 10%. If we had stayed on that pace of job loss, we would have been in another Great Depression by the end of 2009. So they had to break the fall, and it was a very tense and I think pretty compelling story, even if one isn't fascinated by banks, how they managed to do so. I fault Obama for not using his leverage over banks when he had more of it at the beginning of 2009. I think he could have dictated terms to them and restructured them much more effectively than they're doing now when they're not restructuring them. But I think he was right to resist the entreaties of liberals to nationalize the banks. Both Roosevelt and Obama were urged by liberals to nationalize the banks. They both refused, and they were both right. In this case, it saved us about $1 trillion by not nationalizing. So it's a mixed record, and I try to kind of sort through, and it's also rather dramatic behind the scenes. Christina Romer, who I mentioned, the chairwoman of the Council of Economic Advisors, is blocked by Lawrence Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, who was Obama's chief economic advisor, and she charges sexism, which is a strong charge, considering that Summers had been fired from Harvard for what he said about women in the sciences. And Summers says, "Are you threatening me?" And Romer says, "Are you bullying me?" And she goes to Rahm Emanuel, and Emanuel lets her into the meetings with the president. But Obama did block, Summers did effectively block Paul Volcker, the greatest Fed chairman in history, from seeing the president. And even though Obama wanted to get out of that bubble, he really was not as successful as he needed to be in doing so. And he had too small a group of economic advisors in 2009, and I'm critical of them on that. Then there are many other such narrative threads in the story. The one that's probably made the most news in the last couple of weeks involves what happened with Obama and the Pentagon. And there was a lot of publicity about the 20 hours of meetings that took place in the Situation Room. It was the most extensive deliberation over a national security foreign policy issue since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Neither the Vietnam War nor the Iraq War were actually discussed at the highest levels. It's really hard for people to believe, but it's true. We slipped into both those wars inch by inch. So Obama wanted to slow the process down and examine all of the assumptions, and he played good cop, Biden bad cop, as they sent the Pentagon back over and over again for more information. And there was a kind of a confrontation with General Petraeus in the Situation Room over the pace of the escalation and the withdrawal. And Obama said, you know, you told us that we surged in Iraq in 6 months. Why are you saying it's going to take us 21 months to do the same in Afghanistan? And Petraeus eventually backed down, and they came up with a plan to get in fast, get out fast, which I try to walk the reader through a pretty momentous foreign policy decision. Obama didn't want to send more young women to die, and men and women to die, without answers to some very tough questions. And there were a lot of interesting things that happened inside that room. Something I had been wondering about, I'd read in the paper, you probably had too, that the Taliban pays your average Afghan trying to feed his family more than the Afghan army does. So of course a lot of them are going to go with the Taliban. So Obama asks the Pentagon, you know, the brass, is this true? And they say yes. And he says, I want their pay raised. That's an order effective today. And their pay was raised that day in October, and they had the biggest recruitment in December that they had ever had in the Afghan army. So there were just these kinds of things that went on. But the real drama, some of that leaked out at the time. The real drama was over the Pentagon boxing the president in this period. Now, you may remember that you saw General McChrystal on 60 Minutes, or in, New York Times Magazine, Newsweek. He was everywhere saying that we need a 10-year open-ended counterinsurgency, as they called it, counterinsurgency commitment to Afghanistan. He was saying all this at a time when the policy had not yet been decided. So he went to London to give a speech that was approved by Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And in the question and answer, he was asked, you know, could you support a much more limited program with few troops, use Predator drones to kill al-Qaeda, the Biden plan? Much more restricted approach to Afghanistan. And he said, in a word, no. Now, back at the White House, they say, wait a minute. The commanding general in the region just said publicly that if the president sides with the vice president, he cannot support the decision. There's actually a word for that. The word's insubordination. And the president was not happy. None of this was public. The speech was public, but none of the reaction. So Obama is in Copenhagen, and he is there trying to get the Olympics for Chicago, which was a fool's errand. And when he got back, he was asked by one of his people, you know, wasn't that a waste of everybody's time? And he said, I had to go. Michelle would have killed me if I hadn't gone. So when he's in Copenhagen, you may have seen the picture of him with McChrystal on the tarmac on Air Force One. And in that one-on-one meeting, he concludes that McChrystal is the pawn of his superiors, that he was naive. He wasn't trying to undermine the president. He was just talking out of school, and was a good man, and was a great improvement, and tough soldier, and the right guy to be the commanding general. When he gets back to Washington, he hauls Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, into the Oval Office with Bob Gates, the defense secretary, and he says, what was described to me as a cold fury, that he is quote, extremely unhappy with their conduct. He wants to know here and now if they will change their conduct, and that it's doing a, quote, disservice, great disservice, disrespect for our men and women in uniform and for the country to be jamming, manipulating, boxing in, whatever verb you want to use, the president. I asked him, I said, were you jammed by the Pentagon? And his answer on the record was, quote, I neither confirm nor deny that I was jammed by the Pentagon. And you all know what that means. So he pushed back, and he pushed back hard, and Admiral Mullen described himself as chagrined afterward. The Pentagon this week, as the book has come out, is not thrilled that all this is being discussed in public. But it was their discussing it in public that caused the problem in the first place, before a decision had been made. So I was fascinated by this. It was described to me as the most direct confrontation between a president and the military since Truman fired MacArthur, General MacArthur, back in 1951. Biden wanted somebody fired over it, and Obama decided not to fire anybody, in part because they just fired McChrystal's predecessor, General David McKiernan, a few months earlier, and it would be too disruptive to fire too many commanding generals right in a row. And Biden later concluded that they, quote, they got the ticket in the right order, and that it was better that Obama was president and he was not, because he was a cooler head. And that coolness really interested me. At the end of the year, in Copenhagen, again, he wasn't going to go to the climate change conference, but people said, wait, you went to Copenhagen to get the Olympics for Chicago, you can't go try to save the planet in Copenhagen, you got to go, you know. So Hillary Clinton is over there, and I tell the whole story of her selection, which is its own dramatic episode. And by this time, they have a pretty good, very good working relationship. She's not getting anywhere in the conference. It's going badly. She's been there for 11 days, no progress. The developing countries are angry that they're going to have to abide by limitations that the developed world didn't have to worry about in the 19th and 20th century when they were industrializing, and it wasn't fair. But at a minimum, the developed world wanted transparency in the first registry, so that at least we know how much carbon China and the other rapidly developing countries are emitting. And Obama wanted to talk to Premier Wen, the #2 man in China, who he had seen a few weeks earlier in Beijing. Couldn't all day, you know, BlackBerry messages going back and forth. Sometimes the BlackBerry makes things worse because it's, you just want them to talk to each other instead of scheduling meetings that never take place. It was so draped in failure that the Indian Prime Minister Singh, the rumor was he'd already gone to the airport, and the whole thing was going to be a total fiasco. Obama wanted to salvage something, but couldn't seem to get the meeting that he wanted. Then they hear that there's some meeting that they hadn't been told about that's going on, and the Americans decide to go crash the meeting. And it turns out that the Chinese premier, the Indian Prime Minister, had not gone to the airport. He was meeting with the Chinese, Lula of Brazil, and Zuma of South Africa, 4 representatives of the developing world who were the key players at the conference other than the West. And so he crashes the meeting, and the environment and energy minister, Minister Xi of China, is there, and he sees the President of the United States walking in. He says in a mixture of Chinese and English, out, out. Obama ignores this. By the way, there were about 1,500 journalists credentialed for Copenhagen. I wasn't one of them. I wasn't there. But I was the only one who managed to figure out what happened inside this room and when they were cutting the deal. And the president walks in, he grabs a chair, says, hey, Lula, from Brazil. He pulls up a chair. There isn't a chair. And Hillary then is welcomed, and the two of them proceed to negotiate for about 90 minutes with two aides, and they make a lot of progress toward establishing this registry. They're getting down to the short strokes, and they think for the first time, and this indeed is what eventually happened, the Chinese will agree to reveal what they're emitting. And suddenly, Minister Xi starts screaming at Premier Wen in Chinese. And the other heads of state look at the interpreter and for the translation. And then Premier Wen says something to the interpreter, and the interpreter says, "For internal use only." Internal discussion only. And at that point, without missing a beat, the President of the United States says, "I'll take that to mean we have an agreement," and he gets up and walks out of the room. And that's how they got the deal at Copenhagen. So that's the kind of story that I just loved, finding out about, which wasn't obtainable at the time. It's no fault on the reporters who were there. It's just you had to circle back. You had to have the right sources to find that out. So the second kind of point, and I'm going to get to your questions very shortly because I really want to hear from you. The what he's like part, I spend a lot of time on, and I think some of the what happened explains part of what he's like, but I was very interested in what I called his Zen temperament, and I have a chapter called Modus Obama about his MO, and then the one that I think has created some interest is called the Un-Bubba, about how he differs from Bill Clinton. And I didn't think that the comparison to George W. Bush was very interesting. But the comparison between Clinton and Obama I found absolutely fascinating. And they're both very bright men, but they're very different men. And they don't get along very well. And I chart the history of their relationship and the bad blood. I don't do much on the campaign because I wanted to focus on the presidency, but I do. If it was juicy and involved the Clintons, it's in the book. But the main thing I think to understand about Obama in the meetings, and I also tell you what he's like on the basketball court, but in the meetings, if you're there and you're a wallflower, you're sitting along, you're not one of the top principals, as they call it, a cabinet member or senior person, and you're along the wall, you're in real danger of getting called on by the president, which is different than it's been in other administrations. And if you don't come to play, if you're not bringing something to the party, you're full of jargon, you're probably not going to be at the next meeting. But the good news is, when they go home and their wife or husband says, "So you were in a meeting with the president today, what did you say?" They don't have to say, as so many of their predecessors have in prior administrations, "Oh, I didn't get to say anything." Because pretty much everybody in the meeting is weighing in one way or another, and he's drilling down in a very disciplined and pretty crisp way into the problem. Obama is a deductive thinker. Bill Clinton is an inductive thinker. Now, inductive in some ways, I'm inductive, as maybe you can tell from this lecture. It's kind of a euphemism for disorganized thinker. But there's always a trade-off, and one is not superior to the other. And so with Obama, you get a much crisper decision-making process. With Clinton, they called him the second guesser in chief. He was always going back and forth, and they couldn't get a decision. And Obama would make a decision in, an hour that would take Clinton a week. But sometimes the inductive approach, the Clinton approach, will yield more creative policy ideas. And so there's always that trade-off. And I'm not saying that Obama is uncreative, because they've had some creative ideas, but I think this oil spill is an example of how they're not thinking enough outside the box. How do we do something that's unusual? And they're looking a little bit helpless right now, instead of getting on top of this the way they could if they were getting a wider array of advice and thinking in maybe a less organized, less disciplined, more blue sky way about how to address very complicated problem. So I do try to take people who are interested in management and decision-making through, in some detail, the way Obama makes a decision, and then to just kind of explore how he trash talks his friends and, you know, his aides, calls Larry Summers Dr. Kevorkian and teases him for falling asleep in meetings and sweating in winter, and Summers calls Axelrod Che, and Axelrod calls Summers a plutocrat, and just the kinds of things they do with each other. And the key for him, I think, is that he's psychologically healthy. He's not a needy guy. Most politicians are needy. I don't think he's any more psychologically healthy necessarily than the average person, but he is more psychologically healthy than the average politician. And he doesn't have those, most people who I've covered in politics, they're screwed up in one way or another in the head, and Obama might be, but people around him haven't figured it out yet, and they do tend to talk when they identify people's character flaws. He has them, he has his demons, I'm sure, but in part because of what he went through in the writing of his book, and he's not working out. He went through his catharsis earlier in life, and he figured out who he was earlier in life. And so one thing he's very definitely not doing is working out his personality issues in his relationships with other people, which saves a lot of time. And doesn't always give you the right decision, and he made mistakes, plenty of them, but gives you a higher batting average if you're getting a lot of the kind of nonsense in human relations out of the way. So he is well liked by the people who work for him, in part because he doesn't lose his temper and rip their faces off the way Clinton does, and many of them work for both. But he also doesn't give you that warm embrace. I love you, man, I still love you, that you get from Clinton when he forgives you. So that's also a trade-off. So I try to take people into that. And I think I don't want to go into the long evaluation of what worked or what didn't. We can talk about that in the Q&A. But I think his main shortcoming was he lost a connection with the American people and the American middle class as he tried to put points on the board, as they call it. And I'm reminded of a story about Franklin Roosevelt. After Roosevelt died, and this is a story that Eleanor liked to tell, as his funeral procession moved up Pennsylvania Avenue, a grieving man fell to his knees, and the man next to him helped him to his feet and said to the grieving man, "Did you know the president?" And the first man said, "No, but he knew me." Even though he's an aristocrat, patrician. And Obama has plenty of time yet, but so far he doesn't quite have that relationship where people feel like he really understands their problems, understands what they're going through. And that might be in part because of his temperament. Remember they said of FDR goes over to Oliver Wendell Holmes' house just shortly after he's inaugurated as president, and they have some bootleg champagne. It's the end of Prohibition. Can you imagine Obama going over to somebody's house and smoking a joint after the inauguration? When he leaves, Holmes says second-class intellect, first-class temperament. And that was the classic description of Franklin Roosevelt. Barack Obama has a first-class intellect. He's smarter than Franklin Roosevelt. And it seemed like he had the right temperament when he was running against John McCain. A lot of people voted for him for that reason. But the truth is we don't know yet whether he has a first-class public temperament when it comes to that connection to the American people. And this is what's going to keep it so exciting for people like me to cover and for you all to watch, because my book is done, which is good news for me, but the story continues. Thank you so much for listening. It's a great question. It's about Obama's philosophy of governing. What is it? And it's still an open question. He describes himself as having what he calls a, quote, philosophy of persistence, which I I think helps explain why he is en route to being a president of considerable achievement. I think the other important line is the way John F. Kennedy described himself, an idealist without illusions. And Obama is idealistic, but he's very pragmatic also. What he said in his inaugural address about the size of government is it's not a question of whether government is too big or too small, but whether it can work. Again, a very pragmatic approach. The second part of your question, this small business incident, I'm not familiar with it. I doubt it took place in that fashion because they actually have greatly expanded small business loans. I don't think they've expanded them enough, and I am critical of them for assessing small business loans the way a bank would on their prospect for default. They have too many academics, I call them policy mandarins around, who run it all through a computer and say, well, this percentage will default, so the government will lose money, and they shouldn't be looking at it that way, because if small business people lose their businesses, it's not like a big business where it reorganizes and people are okay. The small business person loses everything. And I think that they did not have enough connection to small business. They did not have enough people around Obama with business experience, didn't talk about innovation and entrepreneurship enough. But it wasn't as bad as you're saying, where he clearly is interested in the subject. He was just out this week with small businesses. So it's more a question of how they frame it, how they present it. But it continues to be I think a shortcoming. They didn't even have a Secretary of Commerce who had experience in the business world. So that's one of the areas where I'm critical of him. But I think what people need to avoid is these sort of blanket judgments. I don't make any definitive judgments about the man because it's too soon. My perspective hasn't been deepened by time, and I didn't think it was useful to have another puff job or hatchet job or Obama's great, Obama's terrible. I thought people wanted more information on which to make their own assessment. So that was what I was aiming for. The question is about the relationship with Speaker Pelosi. I think in general it's been a very productive relationship. It didn't start out very well because Obama wanted the House to get rid of all of the things in the stimulus that were attracting bad publicity, even if they were worthwhile ideas like seeding the mall. If you've been on the mall, it does need to be reseeded for a lot of different reasons, but a few days after the inauguration when Republicans were on cable television attacking this or that, and Obama wanted to get them out, and as he said, not lead with his chin, and Pelosi felt like she was being undercut by that, and there were some hard feelings initially, but quite quickly they developed a very good working relationship, and then for most of the year the House wasn't really an issue. They passed health care pretty quickly, and the issue was in the Senate. Then at the end of the process, when they had to adopt the Senate bill intact in order to get it through, and they were 68 votes short, 68 Democratic votes short. These were Democrats who I thought were being kind of nuts. They really thought that it would be better for their party for health care to fail and have a crippled president. It was insane, but they were either on the fence or against, and working together, Pelosi and Obama met with all 68, and they got enough to win a very big victory. So they're very connected to each other at this point. Well, the question is about the teachers being fired in Rhode Island. One of the places where I give Obama the highest marks of all is in education and his Race to the Top program. And I think in that case, it was a standoff between the union and education reformers in a school that was no longer performing, where the graduation rates were pathetic. Kids were not learning anything. And Obama was very much on the side of the reformers. The only reason that the teachers were fired was because they wouldn't make, at first, now they have a deal, which both sides are pretty happy with, but at first they would make no concessions to management that was trying to improve the school. And, you know, they were making just completely, the union was making completely insane demands, like, you want us to stay for an extra 15 minutes, you have to pay each teacher I think it was $100 for them to stay for another 15 minutes. I mean, just kind of crazy positions from the union side. And so he sided with management, and that was then, you know, perceived that he was, nobody was expecting that the teachers were all going to be fired and all out of work. It was part of a labor dispute, and it was resolved. He's very much, yeah, because he's decided, and I think rightly, that there's a great split going on now in the country on education between what Congressman George Miller calls incrementalists and disruptors. And Miller and Bill Gates, who's gotten involved in this with his foundation, and a really fascinating, growing reform movement that I consider myself to be part of, and that I write about a lot, believes that the time for incremental change is over and the time for disruptive change is upon us, and that the whole future of the country depends on us. We've got the greatest higher ed system in the world, but our elementary and secondary system is not producing the graduates that we need. In fact, in many cases, not producing graduates, period. And that bad schools have to be closed, and that school was a good candidate for being closed. And that seniority needs to be reassessed. I mean, I think we've got a situation now where, you know, they spent $100 billion in the stimulus to prevent massive teacher layoffs, which all the Republicans were against. I guess I can't understand. I guess the people who voted against were okay with those massive layoffs. They have 93 Republicans have cut ribbons or issued press releases on stimulus projects that they voted against. Go figure. But one area where the Republicans, I think, have been more right, and the Democrats traditionally have been more wrong, is on teachers' unions. And one of the things that's fascinating is Obama, in a kind of only Nixon could go to China, has decided that he's going to side with those who are willing to take on the teachers' union. Now, he doesn't, as he told his education secretary and basketball buddy, Arnie Duncan, he doesn't want to put a stick in anybody's eye. He doesn't want to needlessly antagonize the unions, but he's quite firm in moving toward accountability. And it's very interesting the way it's playing out with Race to the Top, which we can talk about more if anybody wants to.
Personality did not.
Well, he did take the opportunities, and actually both his very first speech as president before Congress, his speech on healthcare reform in September before a joint session of Congress, and his State of the Union address were all very successful. And people at the time, you know, there was a lot of cheering. Congress liked it. Public liked it. He seemed to be communicating. But he has such a disdain for sound bites that the effect wears off. A speech it's kind of like fast food or something. You know, if there's not something to hang on to, people don't remember it. And he is allergic to sound bites. He considers talking points and sound bites to be an insult. And he forgets that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Abraham Lincoln. Soundbite. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Franklin Roosevelt. Soundbite. And he needs to get back to, you know, some of the things he was talking about in the campaign, that he was more willing to use sound bites. I think you're going to start to see him do that a little bit more. So, for instance, recently he started saying, you know, the Republicans drove us into the ditch, and now they want us to give them the keys. No way, you know. And he's starting to repeat that a little bit again, because he thinks that, see, Roosevelt blamed Hoover for everything. For years, for a decade, he blamed everything on Herbert Hoover. Ronald Reagan, for 8 years, blamed Jimmy Carter over and over and over again. Obama did not blame George W. Bush, and after the Massachusetts loss, he thought, you know, maybe he should have done more of that. Maybe he would get credit for some of the things he did. Instead, he felt like he was part of what I call a shovel brigade. You know, the people come up and clean up after the elephants, after the circus, right? And that's what Reagan's chief of staff described his job as, a shovel brigade. Obama, I think, is frustrated that so much of what he's done has been cleaning up messes that were left for him. And he said he told me that he knew that these bailouts would be political suicide for him, just toxic. The American people hate them. But he felt like he had to do it to prevent a depression. So in some ways he was caught in a trap. Yeah, I quote an organization called PolitiFact, which is associated with the St. Pete Times, and they won a Pulitzer Prize last year, and they added up all Obama's promises, and they found out that of 500 promises he kept or made progress on 385 just in his first year. Guantanamo was one of the big failures, and I tell the story in the book about why it was much, much harder to close Guantanamo than they anticipated, partly because of Congress. You know, that's the thing. I think a lot of Obama supporters, they have a kind of a magic wand theory of government. Oh, Obama, we elected him. Now it's Miller time. We can just relax. He can do all these changes we elected him to do. And that's just really, not you, but that's just really naive about the way Washington works, the way politics works. And Obama, said during the campaign, we are the ones we've been waiting for. Well, a lot of the we didn't show up. And those town meetings last summer, they were all Obama opponents, Tea Party, and the Obama supporters were nowhere to be found. And so change is hard, and he knew it was going to be hard, but maybe even a little bit harder than he realized on issues like Guantanamo, where he messed up. Well, I think it's on his watch, and I think it's going to be a continuing problem for him. But this is one where there's just no question. I was on a conservative radio talk show today with Laura Ingraham, and I was arguing with her about this. She said, "Oh, you're going to blame Halliburton and Bush for all this?" And I go, "You got it, baby." And yep. I mean, I did a story a few years ago on Bush's transition. I found out that when Bush came in, they needed a new chairman of the Energy Regulatory Commission, energy regulator. And who was going to interview the candidates to be chairman? Would it be, one of Bush's aides from the campaign? Would it be somebody he knew from Well, the person that Bush appointed to interview candidates for head of the Energy Regulatory Association and select the new chairman of the Energy Regulatory Commission was a guy named Ken Lay. And so that's what happened in this country for 8 years in terms of the energy industry. So Obama is not handling this as well as he could, but he inherited a situation where the regulators, in some cases we've learned, were literally in bed, literally sleeping with the people from the oil companies. Well, I don't think he's been studied. He's been the most covered. This is the first book about his presidency, so he hasn't been studied yet, very much. But he's been. I think what I said was the most observed and least understood, and there's just been so much coverage. But the problem is because there hasn't been very much time that's gone yet. We don't have the perspective of history. We're only now beginning to pull back the curtain, which is what I was trying to start to do. So if history is the first rough draft, if journalism is the first rough draft of history, as Phil Graham, who was, until now, his family was the owner of the Washington Post Company, which owns Newsweek. My book is not a first rough draft, but it's only a second draft, and there's going to be a lot more to come as we gain more understanding of this man. Let me just try to answer these two real quick. Well, the deal with Lindsey Graham changed after the Christmas Day bomber incident with Abdul Muttalib and the underwear bomber. And so what looked like a deal suddenly became much less tenable as the mood changed on Capitol Hill. And so while the odds were smaller than they had been of closing Guantanamo before Christmas, after Christmas they got even smaller. And I don't think that Graham's offer is really much on the table right now. There just aren't a lot of votes. I tell the story of the dismissal of Greg Craig as White House counsel, which was tied up in the whole Gitmo issue, but it was not on the positive side of the ledger for Obama in 2009. I don't know if that answers your question, but the real answer is we don't know yet. By the way, these are friends of mine from Montclair, New Jersey. So, in the interest of full disclosure, hi, Ron. That's a really interesting question. Just to repeat it, I'm sorry I haven't been repeating enough of these questions. Obama came to office telling his folks that he was going to take risks and he could be a one-term president and that they should get used to his taking risks. And then I quote him later in the book saying, you know, we weren't here to do school uniforms, which was a shot at Bill Clinton, the small ball of the Clinton administration. And one of his friends said that Obama's nightmare is that he's in his 50s and 60s and looking back on his time in office and thinking, if I could have only done this, I didn't make the most of it. And so he's determined to do things, not just be president. At the same time, like any politician, he would like to get reelected. So he's torn between those two. And you know, I also, a friend of his quotes Obama in my book saying, you know, I don't know why anybody would want this job for 2 terms, but you know, I'll be damned if I'll let Mitt Romney come in and take credit for all the good things we accomplish after we've been through all this crap. And I think that pretty much kind of summarized his attitude. I do think that he sees this as a political year where he'll be more focused on holding the Congress, which I actually think he will do, not with the same numbers that he had so far, but you know, continuing to have Democratic control of Congress, definitely of the Senate and probably of the House. And then in 2011, he'll again try to put some points on the board, as he calls it, take some risks, and then I would imagine in 2012 he'll be more political again. And no president is effective if they're not a good politician. There's no such thing as being above politics, beyond politics. That's just a recipe for failure. Lincoln was a brilliant politician. Jefferson, good politician. You know, he didn't want to add any land to the United States or have the federal government do anything until Napoleon sold him Louisiana Purchase. You know, and circumstances change. If you're not a supple, flexible politician, it doesn't work for you. I think Obama is a good politician, but he has been having some problems in executing on the communications front. And if he gets that together, I think he'll be able to continue to take some big risks. But part of it depends on whether this election in this fall is very, very important because really it's, I would argue, it's less of a verdict on Obama, who's not on the ballot, than it is on the Republican strategy of obstruction, which may have been politically very smart. Obama was surprised by it. He told me he thought they would have more interest in governing. That was the quote from him, that, you know, he couldn't believe that none of them would be for the stimulus because it was bringing things to help people in their districts. And Republican conservative economists who've been Ronald Reagan's economists were for it. So he was kind of stunned, but it was an interesting strategy by them to obstruct and see if they could take power again. And if it fails, and they don't take power in the Congress, it'll be very interesting to see what the shape of the Republican Party is next year. Will they continue to go to the right, or will they say, you know, that didn't work out as well as we'd hoped, maybe we should compromise more and work on governing. And that's part of what keeps the story interesting as we move forward. And I think that in the final analysis, these are human beings. They all make mistakes. And what I tried to do was kind of take a step back from the heat of the moment when people are too often either kind of mindless cheerleaders or they're looking for fault in everything that one of these presidents does, depending on their party. And instead just try to look at it as history. And I just would close by telling you a little story from the other night. There was a book party for me in Washington. There was a man there named Harris Wofford who had been in the U.S. Senate. And he's actually the man who was responsible for John F. Kennedy being elected president in 1960. He was Kennedy's civil rights advisor. He's now in his 80s. And he advised Kennedy to call Coretta Scott King when Martin Luther King was in Birmingham jail. And when Kennedy, over Bobby Kennedy's objections, in fact, Wofford didn't even tell Bobby Kennedy about it, when Kennedy took Wofford's advice, large numbers of African Americans moved from being Republicans, the party of Lincoln. Jackie Robinson and Daddy King had been for Nixon. They changed overnight to being for Kennedy, and Kennedy won the election. It was just enough to, if Kennedy had lost Illinois, it's a big myth, if he'd lost Illinois to Nixon, Kennedy still would have been elected. So it wasn't Daley from my hometown who stole the election. It's just a myth. If you look at the math, the Electoral College math, it was blacks shifting to Kennedy. Anyway, the same man was at this book party for my book, and he slipped on a step, and he had a very serious fall, and there was blood all over him. And as we were waiting for the ambulance a couple nights ago, I wanted to make sure he stayed conscious, didn't go into shock. So I said, Harris, tell me about Selma. Did you bleed like this at Selma? He had been with King in Selma. And Harris said, no, I didn't get beat up there. And he told a long story about Selma and how the bleeding that he was suffering then was much worse than anything that had happened to him in the civil rights movement. But he told the story of the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the rest of it, and until the ambulance arrived. And so I said to the guests later at the party, and I would say to you, that history is all around us. We are living history. When you're living it, you don't always know it, because it doesn't seem like history. It seems like something somebody's yakking about on talk radio, you know? And so what I tried to do, and what I think everybody here can do in their own lives, and what this center is dedicated to, and that's the brilliant thing about this institution you have in your community, is to understand the historical context of our times and to have some sense, whatever one's politics, that in the words of the old proverb, we're cursed to live in interesting times. Thank you so much for listening.